Very good, welcome. And once again, please welcome Steve Novella to the panel. All righty, so neuroscience is, it's like a pop culture subject today. I mean, it's transcended science, it's transcended medicine. I think it's fair to say it's a pop culture subject. You go into the bookstore and you see all kinds of books that find ways of talking about neuroscience. So before we even get into any specific issues, talk to me briefly about the whole notion of fMRI technology. If you would briefly, what is it? And comment on its popularity, if you would, for me.
Okay, sure. So just before we start, I feel comfortable saying with Sally, also from Yale up here, that Harvard could suck it. You would, my esteemed colleague would probably agree with that. So yeah, fMRI technology is very interesting. It's intrafunctional MRI scans, and it's a way of looking at the brain functioning in real time. Looking at the brain metabolizing, essentially. And you could essentially give people tasks to do while you're scanning their brain. Then you can see which parts of the brain light up. So as a research tool, you're looking for neuroanatomical correlates of whatever you're having the subject do while you're looking at their brain activity. There are, of course, a lot of problems or challenges with that technology as a research tool. So I personally think it's a very exciting, very powerful research tool, but at the same time, it's really tricky. And so you will see a lot of crappy, fMRI studies that the results of which are, I think, dubious. So one challenge is that you're pulling signal out of a lot of noise. The brain, there's all kinds of activity going on in the brain all the time, and the way you're saying, it's not like you have a non-functioning brain, at least than most people, and then you have them do something and they do that one precise task and that one part of the brain lights up. What you have is all kinds of chaotic brain activity, then you have them do something and that increases some kind of activity in a statistical fashion. You look at 20 subjects, you average their fMRIs over time, and you come up with this pretty picture that's an average of an average, and the researchers say, oh look, we have this 60% signal out of the 50% noise in the background. And whenever you're sort of filtering out lots of noise to see this little signal, you got to be if you're not absolutely rigorous in your technique, you could be looking at just illusions. You could just be looking at artifact. And so until studies get replicated and the research is really to very high level of rigor, it's actually hard to know what to make of these pretty pictures that we see. But when you do get to pretty a good consensus of rigorous studies of fMRI scans, we're seeing circuitry in the brain, and that's really advancing the research of neuroanatomical correlates of what parts of the brain are doing what. And now we're getting to the deeper levels of complexity where we're trying to figure out the basic concepts of how the brain is organized, which is hard because it's hard to know what are the fundamental elements of thought and behavior, and it doesn't necessarily cleave in the same way we naively would think that it does. So we're slowly grinding forward, but it's very challenging research.
And Sally, before we start to drill down on some specific subjects, the title of your book is The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. So in a similar vein, talk to me about what is mindless neuroscience as opposed to, I guess, mindful.
Neuroscience, right. Yeah, well, the title of the book that I wanted was 50 Shades of Gray Matter. Which would have expanded on this theory, the seductive element. But why are brain scans so seductive? Why is neuroscience so compelling? And with good reason, for sure. I mean, my co-author and I, Scott Lilienfeld, who's a psychologist at Emory, I hope we made sure on every page that we are in awe of the technology and the brilliant people who've devised it. It's actually the media and some folks that we call neuro-entrepreneurs, and the occasional neuroscientist someone mentioned some of the egos earlier, sometimes believe their press releases on these things. But basically, why is it so seductive? Well, I think there's a perfect storm that's fed by about four factors. One is that it is the brain, which is, I don't think it's hyperbole to say, it's probably the last great scientific frontier. the most complicated organ by far. If at the end we'll know this much when we're all dead, now we know this much. So it's fascinating and endlessly fascinating. It's the brain, it's technology with its promise of objectivity, it's beautiful biological portraiture. I mean, the scans are amazing, very arresting, and we are visual primates, so we're particularly drawn to them. And finally, and this was the most interesting aspect of it to me, when we see a part of the brain light up, which by now we know, I mean, we're almost past that phase of lighting up.
Yeah.
I mean, that has been called, with varying degrees of seriousness, neurophrenology. But, you know, there's some merit to that because the brain is not a bunch of isolated neural islands. It's the interconnectivity, it's where the money is. But when you see something light up, or the center for this or the center for that, it creates the impression of a very tidy brain-to-behavior narrative, suggesting that whatever behavior we're talking about, whatever behavior has this neural correlate, is a behavior that would inexorably flow from this brain activity and is therefore involuntary. And that is not a kind of conclusion one can draw simply from looking at scans. But it's finding its way into courtrooms, it's finding its way into settings where whether or not one's behavior is voluntary or not matters a heck of a lot.
Yeah.
Right, and well, someone once said, you know, every problem has a simple solution, and it's usually wrong.
Yeah.
And it is appealing, and it's not a bad thing that it's appealing. We can see where the appeal is, and people are fascinated by the human mind, and if science can tell us something more, I mean, that's a good thing that people are optimistic. The problem is we're so early in the game.
Exactly. Right? The premature application, the interpretive license, you know, that's where you get...
Yeah.
Me? Oh.
Yeah, everybody on these,
funny,
you have to get really close to these minds.
I just said it's the overinterpretation, the premature application that we've seen in courtrooms and some other places. Marketing, although no one, I think, cries too much when marketers may be wasting their money on certain things. But
yeah, if I could expand on the complexity issue, because I think we actually know a lot about brain function, but there's a lot more we don't know, which is great. But part of the complexity is if like one part of the brain becomes active in a certain task, that doesn't mean that that part of the brain does that task or that it equals that task, which is what Sally is saying. Think about it this way: there's different parts of the brain that participate in multiple different networks, and they may have a different function in every different network in which they participate. So what does it mean when that part of the brain is active? What network are they participating in, and what functioning are they subsuming? Well, you know, that the levels of complexity are so far beyond where the current research stands that, you know, we can't really say. We're just generating hypotheses, trying to figure out how to test them and grind forward. But but of course, there's always the hype that wants to leap decades ahead of where the research actually is and say, you know, that we can reduce. It's a hyper-reductionist approach, that we could reduce human mood, thought, and behavior to different parts of the brain lighting up or being active, and we're not there.
And I often think that the day-to-day problem, you know, a fundamental problem of being human is trying to distinguish on a daily basis the difference between causality and confluence. And this is really a perfect example, because just as, you know, you're studying happiness or you're studying anger or you're studying fear or pain, just because a particular part of the brain lights up doesn't really mean it's causal, because you could say, well, it's some kind of excitement that very different emotions could have in common, and that's what's lighting up, if you will, right? So before we get into some of these, shall we say, the even darker implications, just in terms of the pop culture, how many people have heard of brain training? Brain training? Ring some bells? Right, bunch of hands. So Steve, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, this is one of the things I particularly find annoying is the concept of brain training. Like,
he's got a long list.
Yeah, I do. That's good. Yeah, the things you annoy you, that's a good thing. So, like Lumosity.com says, so the scientifically designed, you know, task that's going to train your brain to be smarter, to function better. What does that really mean? And again, I think that it's a marketing way of trying to encourage this hyper-reductionist way of thinking about there's something magical happening in the brain. It's not you doing something, it's the brain learning or training. So, like, what's the difference between brain training and learning? Nothing. It's just it's a marketing term. It's a marketing spin that you're putting on your learning. Yeah. Or when they talk about brain plasticity, yeah, that's a very important concept. The brain is not hardware or software. It's wetware, and the brain changes its actual structure. It's the connections, as that's part of the learning process. When you are reading something and learning, that's brain plasticity. You're encoding new memories in the neurons themselves, in the wetware. And when you shoot baskets, yeah, you will train those pathways to function more efficiently, and you get to rely more on your subconscious processing. So you need less high energy intensive conscious processing in order to do that. That's practice. It's brain training, but you're practicing shooting baskets. So it's trying to use a terminology like where we engage the brain's plasticity in order to have brain training to make something that's everyday and mundane sound sciencey and sexy. That's really all that it is. When you talk about the next level is, okay, but are the games that they're marketing to you are they more beneficial than doing anything else that's roughly equivalent in terms of the amount of time and complexity? And so far, I mean, I've looked as deeply as I could into this research. I don't do this research, but I've read as much of it as I can. It seems that the short answer is, well, no, not really. I mean, what you learn to do whatever it is you're doing. Whatever the game is, you get good at that game. So there's no question about that. And again, that's good old-fashioned learning. The other question is, okay, well, how far afield can you go from the specific task? And do you still gain some improved ability? So if you do a verbal game, you get better at that verbal game. That's uncontroversial. Do you get better at other similar verbal tasks, at other dissimilar verbal tasks, at other nonverbal tasks, at generic attention, memory, concentration? So how far afield does the benefits go from when you're learning to do something? And I don't think that question has been definitively answered, but I think that the best answer we have right now is not very far. The benefits do not stray far from the very task that you're doing. Maybe there's a little bit of bleed over into related verbal tasks, but I haven't seen any compelling evidence that the benefits go beyond that. But that's the implied claim. And when you read sites like Lumosity, they're very careful not to make any actual claims, which is smart. It's very smart marketing on their part, but the implication is blatantly there that you're getting smarter. And there's just no evidence for that. And the idea that it's scientifically designed to make you smarter is based upon nothing, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, the other manifestation that we see in the press is because we see a neural correlate of something, that means it's real. So pain is now real. PTSD is now real because we see more activity in the amygdala and other areas that are involved with hyperarousal and agitation. Did I say depression is real? Well, this is kind of, again, a form of neuroredundance, that's what we call it, which is, A, we knew it was real before, and when, in particular, when we get to addiction, which happens to be my special area of focus, not only is it in the brain and it's real, but because, again, we can see it, and I alluded to this before, that means addicts have no control. And that's a very, very, it's a wrong message. I can define, maybe when we go on or right now, I could define much more clearly what I mean by control, because certainly people act like they're out of control. There's no question about that. And you have to wonder, in the most severe cases, how could a person possibly be in control when they lose their family and these horrible, horrible consequences happen? But I mean something very precise here, and I do think even people who have those, are in that, what sounds like a horrible spiral, are salvageable. I believe that about everyone. But what we hear, and in fact this is what really stimulated Scott and I to start working on this book, is that this is the mantra in addiction research, and to some extent in the clinic, and you hear it in the public discourse as well, which is addiction is a brain disease, which is an interesting way to put it. Well, why do you call it a brain disease? And the answer to the folks who promote it most strenuously, who happen to be folks at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, will say, well, because there are changes in the brain that accompany addiction. And that's clearly true. But the question is, what kinds of brain changes are they? Because there are changes in the brain that accompany Alzheimer's. There are changes in the brain that you see with people who are in their florid phase of schizophrenia. So how are these brain changes different? Well, in one major way, the brain changes that accompany addiction do not prevent people from responding to meaningful consequences and deterrence. And there is a massive literature on work with drug addicts. And in the real world, it manifests most dramatically in the criminal justice system. And I don't mean incarceration. I'm talking about things like drug courts and other kinds of enlightened diversion programs that use a very good, effective form of contingency management, meaning that there are swift and certain and fair but not severe consequences for messing up. And a mess up might be handing in a positive urine, something like this. There are drug testing, there's intensive monitoring, and the consequences for some sort of violation are immediate and predictable. And that is a very good way to shape behavior. Now, if I did that with someone with Alzheimer's, if I said, if your memory deteriorates, I'll give you $1 million. I'll give you $200 in your case, but if your memory doesn't deteriorate, or I will blow your head off if it does, I'm sorry, that's not a condition that is responsive to those kinds of conditions. And that's what I mean by voluntariness. That's the essence of behavioral voluntariness, that it's deterrable. Not that it's easy, but that it is. And that if you work with the environment and the patient the right way, which is hard to do when they're out there getting high all the time, but if and when they make a decision, which people do, to come in for help, that's when you can do this. The criminal justice system, ironically, has more leverage than I do in a clinic to work with someone because, they can play the levers. And in the drug courts, the charges are dropped at the end of the year if you comply. So it's a good deal.
But yeah, so I think the concept there that sort of overlaps the panel discussion is that the abuse of neuroscience is, again, this hyper-reductionist. You're trying to take something that's both psychological, behavioral, and neurological and say, no, it's a brain disease, and the term is very loaded. And it's a way of reducing this multiple levels of complex interaction down to stuff is happening in the brain. Therefore, it's not the person, it's not anything else, it's not society, it's not their history or whatever, it's the problem with their brain. So it's kind of like the devil made me do it, almost sort of thing, that my brain made me do it, I didn't do it, my brain did it, but you are your brain. And so it's making these sort of artificial distinctions to try to frame it in the language of pathology when it's more, I'm not saying it's not a disorder. I think that then people go too far the other way and say, well, if it's not pathology, it's nothing. But I think, no, it is something. It's more than just brain pathology or brain disease. It's this multi-level problem that requires psychology, ecology, all this other stuff to come into play.
No, that's exactly right. And of course, we had to coin a word to encapsulate that, which was neurocentrism, really. Yeah. The idea that explanations of complex behavior that reside at the level of the brain are inevitably more real, more authentic, more true than any other description. And that's why we focus, we have a whole chapter on addiction, because that's a perfect illustration of what we think of as the problem of explanatory framework. If you focus too hard explaining this at the level of the brain, which is a legitimate level, there's no question about it, but to the exclusion of the psychological, which is to say, newsflash, people use drugs for reasons. You wouldn't even think that way if you talk just about dopamine and serotonin and the reward pathways, that there are reasons involved, right, that they're thinking intentional, motivational creatures here, that environmental changes make a difference. Getting funding, now NIDA does fund some of this contingency management, but not nearly enough So it manifests also in the research portfolio of the agency, which I personally think is warped. But so yeah, it's what a great disservice you do to such a complicated behavior by just looking at it at one level, as you said.
So the notion that fMRI technology, for example, has suddenly told us that these conditions are real, which we already knew, may well be spurious, and leads to this conversation about distinctions between addiction versus disease models, or disorders versus disease models. But can I ask, what, with regard to addiction, has fMRI told us?
Well, it's told us about mechanism, but the mind, well, of course the mind is generated by the brain. We all know that, of course. But it's told us a lot about mechanism. I would say at this point it has told us nothing about that's been translatable into treatment. Will it never? I wouldn't say that. It just hasn't. I work in a methadone clinic, so you know, but methadone is a medication that's it's an opiate, synthetic opiate, so it replaces heroin. I only say that because it shows that I don't have some ideological aversion to using medication, or what I would say medication or any kind of implant or this kind of thing, which would be a more direct action on the brain. I mean, even talking to patients, of course, is ultimately an action on the brain because everything ultimately gets mediated by the brain. So that goes without saying. But nope, I would argue that it hasn't advanced our treatment at all. And methadone, believe it or not, you know, which came over from Germany in the late 50s and was used in methadone clinics for the first time in the 60s, is still the best intervention we have. And it doesn't even treat addiction, it treats withdrawal. And treating withdrawal is enough for some people. Just to be stabilized is enough for them to get their act together. But
can I follow up on something
please.
you said too? That you also you premised this by saying if something's happening in the brain, then it's real, and we know that that is spurious. Yeah, of course there's stuff happening in the brain, but there's a darker side to that as well, because then what people will do is they will look at pseudosciences. Like, let's just take acupuncture, for example, and they'll look, when I stick a needle in the guy's foot, something happens in the brain. Therefore, it's real. Something real is happening. Well, of course stuff is happening in the brain because you're sticking a needle in his foot and he's feeling the pain or whatever. Or when people meditate,
right,
their brain activity changes. Of course it changes because their attitude has changed. They're relaxing and they're thinking in a certain way, and that's whenever we do anything, it's reflected in the brain because, as Sally said, the mind is what the brain does. So, but once you make that spurious, some oversimplistic connection of if I could see stuff happening in the brain, therefore it's real, they apply that to a lot of very dubious things. Not so to some stuff we already knew that was real, and then to other stuff that isn't real, meaning that it's nothing beyond the superficial stuff that's happening that's obvious.
So it won't take us long to be cataloging some of the dangers of fMRI and misuses, and we're going to get to that momentarily. But tell me what we've learned anywhere that's been useful, pointable out of fMRI studies and technology in the past decade.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what you're asking. I mean, in terms of like translational research, like tell me the treatment for X. I don't know that I could think of an example off the top of my head. I don't know enough to categorically say it doesn't exist.
Just the Mayberg stuff, maybe?
Yeah, perhaps. But I think right now it's at the level of it's a really exciting research tool. We're just using it to kind of reverse engineer the neuroanatomical structure of the brain. And we're still also in the phase, which I always find exciting, the phase of where we're figuring out how much we don't know. So we kind of were, I'm not going to say plateauing, but the previous research methods were sort of taking us as far as they could, and we had kind of a stable but oversimplified version of the neuroanatomical structure of the brain. Now we got these new technologies, these new windows, and we're learning how much we don't know. That, oh my God, there's layers of complexity here that we kind of thought were there, but we're really seeing how complex it is. So I think it's actually our ignorance has increased more.
Right. So
from
we've mapped the
fMRI.
human genome, but we haven't necessarily figured out how exactly to use that. We
that's
haven't
good,
solved
but-
a million diseases yet by mapping
Exactly.
the genome, and this is a similar
Yeah.
thing. We have a new tool, a new way of describing
Right.
the brain, and maybe we're just not sure yet what.
But I think
what to
that
do
that's a
with it.
good sign. When your ignorance increases, that means you're onto something.
Right.
You're making progress. I think
Right.
we're still in that
Science is often a
sort of
measure.
phase.
Science is often a more precise measure of what we don't know.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something to that?
I actually did think of something. It's not about treatment per se, but where I could imagine it being useful. I've never done this, but I could imagine that it being useful to show certain patients, for example, an image. Almost take advantage of this reification. Maybe it's a little dishonest in a way, but take advantage of being able to show them something that's lighting up. When it comes to the phenomena of what's called conditioned craving, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically people who, it doesn't even have to be drugs. It can be anything, food, anything that we like, and like a lot. We tend to have a kind of almost an unbidden desire for a rush of craving when we are confronted with Pavlovian cues or reminders, other kinds of activities or mood states, or even typically it's people and places that you got high with or used with. And that these truly involuntarily incite sort of a rush of desire to use it. That's why, of course, if you're trying not to drink, you stay out of bars, not only because that's where the alcohol is, but because it'll be a very potent reminder, and you will have an intense desire. It's a setup for yourself, right? So much of therapy, in fact, ends up being controlling these cues and identifying them. How do I stay away from this? How do I not get money? I shouldn't get money in my hand at the end of the week, because money means cocaine, and so you get the money direct deposited. I mean, tricks like this, you play on yourself. But to a person who's very motivated and trying all these exercises, and they still feel that rush of desire, they may feel demoralized because of that, or think, well, I am really trying, so what's going on here? And there I could see saying, well, this is what's happening in you have no control over this part. This is a natural phenomenon where people are reminded, as I said, in a Pavlovian way, this is what conditioned craving is, and so you're going to feel it. Now, this is what you do when you feel it. You don't have to give into it at all. But that's kind of calming to some people to see that this is not a contradiction. This doesn't repudiate my real sincere desire to quit.
Gotcha. So moving on from some of these aspects of addiction, which we may come back to in another context later, but I gather you have an interest in a subject of long interest to me, which is lie detection. Yes, Sally, you.
I wouldn't say it's a long. I lie a lot. I've been lying for a long time.
No, I'm saying it's a long. I'm saying it's a long time interest to me, actually.
There's a chapter in the book.
There's a chapter in the book about it, and from my vantage, the polygraph is pseudoscience and doesn't work, and the people who really believe in it are the guys who operate the machines, and it's incredible how influential it is in business and government. But fortunately, there's some protections that have still kept it out of the courtroom. But now there are attempts, new encroachments. There are entrepreneurs who are trying to use things like fMRI as a new kind of lie detection.
Right. They haven't made headway yet, but there are two companies, or there were. I kind of think CFOS might have gone out of business. That's what I've heard. But there's one with a name that is so endearing, really. It's called No Lie fMRI. They're in, oh gosh, I forgot. They're in California. And you can go in for $5,000. They will scan your brain while they're asking you pretty much the kinds of questions that a polygrapher would ask you. Is the sky blue? Did you kill your wife? Those kinds of things. And
they're all Mormons?
Oh!
Thank you.
And theoretically, what they would claim is that there is a neural signature of truth. And what they mean, to be fair, in very, very, very controlled situations, lab conditions so controlled that it's hard to imagine how they could ever universalize to the real world. There have been experiments, some of the first ones done at the University of Pennsylvania, where they bring a guy in a room and show him a watch and a ring, I think, and say, we want you to take one. And the person does take one, and it's filmed, so people know the ground truth. And then he is subjected to an fMRI and asked these questions about which one he took. And they, pull the brain scans from about, their sample sizes were, for this work, respectable, like 20 or something, or two groups of 20. And were able to tell with pretty good accuracy, actually, who was telling the truth about what they took and who wasn't. And that's interesting. And the idea there is that it takes more neural energy to suppress an honest answer. However, when they looked at the actual parts of the brain that were relatively more active, and remember, we're always talking about relative activation. If your brain ain't active, you're dead. Even though they show it as black, I mean, that just means what's lit is an increased activation. But the areas of increased activation are all over the place, but still, statistically, when they compared the lying group to the truthful group, they did find a real difference that then they were used to predict in the next series of patients people, who lied.
If this is accurate, that they are claiming to be able to find a measure of a truth response, that is a very different claim than a polygraph. Polygraph, although in the popular culture it may seem that, polygraph doesn't measure truthfulness at all, and it actually does not even measure deception.
Right.
And the whole notion that there's a series of base questions that they ask to get what the truth is, that's not at all how a polygraph works, and that is a myth that polygraphers use because they want the subject to believe that. But actually, the base questions is trying to get a measure of agitation. Mm-hmm. They're asking you a bunch of normal questions that give you a kind of a low peak, but then they're trying to ask you questions that are actually not easily answered, and the measure of that, which puts you supposedly in a distressed state, now they're going to try and identify that when they ask you the significant questions. It's a huge smoke screen of around the body. If you actually look at the theory even behind what they actually claim they're doing, it's kind of lunatic. So if the claim here is actually at least some attempt
trying to
tell
go straight
truth,
to the
it's
organ.
a very different model.
Oh, it is. It's trying to go straight to the organ of deception and not the autonomic
Right,
manifestation
exactly.
of anxiety, which I'd be damn anxious if somebody accused me of lying when I didn't. So that's why there's so many false positives.
You get anxious just by being
But you might be
accused.
anxious being asked. Innocent people get asked, get anxious, and if everybody got anxious lying, then I'm a mythical creature.
Right.
Because I get paid for it.
Except for the psychopaths, they don't get anxious.
Right. That's a different breed. You wanted to add something?
Well, I think we could broaden the conversation a little bit too, because what we're really asking is, does fMRI have diagnostic utility, right? So we talked about, is it useful clinically? Obviously it's useful as a research tool, but tricky. It's not quite useful clinically yet. You could look at lie detection as one clinical application, or maybe one diagnostic application of it, but the same principles apply to any diagnostic application of fMRI scan. We want to look at brain activity in an individual person and then say something about that person. They have schizophrenia, they have Alzheimer's disease, they have a brain tumor, whatever. Probably the utility of that kind of study is helpful in looking for stuff like brain tumors. So I think that's because brain tumors are really metabolically active, whereas some other kinds of lesions are not very active. So that's actually an established diagnostic tool, although we tend to use PET scanning, which is an older technology. But you could use fMRI diagnostically for that as well. But if you're asking a more sophisticated question, is this person a schizophrenic based upon their fMRI activity, then I don't think we're quite there yet, and we may never get there because the research looks for statistical differences among groups of people, and this applies beyond fMRI or beyond neuroscience. Just in medicine in general, when you have statistical differences between groups of people, that doesn't necessarily give you enough information to tell that this individual does or does not have an entity. The predictive value or the the sensitivity and specificity may be below what is useful for clinical purposes. But then, again, there's always somebody to make a bad argument about something. So they'll say, well, okay, but because you can't make the diagnosis of schizophrenia based on the fMRI scan, that it's worthless. Well, no, it may be useful in making statistical statements about groups of individuals. That still can be useful, even though it's not useful making a diagnosis in an individual. So again, in my opinion, that kind of puts it back into the realm of research and not quite ready for clinical utility, whether it is, beyond maybe some very specific applications. I don't know. But just so that we're clear, it doesn't impugn it as a research tool. Yeah.
What about the pathways to exploration of artificial intelligence, for example, and comparisons, the ongoing constant comparisons between human brains and computers? Is fMRI telling us something about that?
Well, I think, I've written about that before, about this whole notion, the relationship between the research groups who are trying to essentially reverse engineer the brain and research groups who are trying to develop artificial intelligence, and I think they are going to increasingly play off of each other in that, like, we can build a cortical column now virtually in a computer. Like a mouse cortical column, but it doesn't matter. It's pretty much, it's a mammalian, basic fundamental unit of the mammalian cortex. You multiply that by a few million and you got a brain. You multiply that by, I think, 1 billion or so, and you got a human brain. We don't have computers yet powerful enough to do that, but the basic component is there. So then we could do things like build computer software algorithms based upon the visual, our theories of how the visual system is wired together, and then see what happens. And so we actually can get useful software applications out of algorithms that we're reverse engineering from mammalian brains, and that in turn can inform us about what the human brain organization actually is. We're at the infancy of this, but I think that these are going to increasingly feed off of each other, and we're into the future where we're going to be, in other words, we're figuring out how the brain works by trying to model it in a computer, and that is helping us model artificial intelligence because we're sort of copying brains. So they will feed into each other.
Did you want to add something?
Not my field.
No black cars in that answer.
No black cars.
And this is something, I'm sorry Heather's not here, something that we were talking about yesterday a little bit, but I know, Steve, you have some familiarity with. So there's a popular book called Sleights of Mind, written by Stephen Macknick and Susanna Martinez-Condi, who are neuroscientists and researchers. And this is about a proposed neuroscience, so-called neuroscience of magic. And it has to do with some of the principles and ideas that magicians who have centuries of accumulated practical knowledge about psychology and the tools that we use. Because we don't really fool people's eyes, we fool people's brains. So we know something about how people think. And now, with or without fMRI, whatever the case may be, but there is an interest in seeing where science and magic can mix and what one has to teach the other, if you will. So you have some familiarity?
Yeah. I mean, I read the book and I interviewed them, and I'm familiar with the idea. What's interesting is that magicians have been doing neuroscience for centuries and didn't realize it, which is, they've been conducting psychological experiments.
We knew we were doing psychology. We knew that. I mean, there's a long literature about it.
But I mean, to the point, I agree with that. But applied psychology, but real neuroscience, like beyond just, how to deceive people, actually looking at how people, like the kind of experiments that a psychologist would do to try to figure out how human attention works and how the human visual system works. Like, for example, when we interviewed Martinez about this topic, they said, it was really interesting that if like a magician will take an object and do like a flourish over an arc, your eye will follow the object over the entire arc. But if you go in a straight line, your eyes will, what's called the saccadic movement. It'll jump from point A to point B. And when your eyes jump from point A to point B, your brain suppresses everything in between, because otherwise the world would be jittery and jumpy. So this is, again, I talked the other day about continuity, favoring continuity over over detail. So that's one of the ways in which your brain favors continuity. It suppresses your visual input during the saccadic movement. So a magician could theoretically do something while you're saccading over, and you would miss it because your brain is fit out. But if the magician wants your eye to follow his hand, they'll do it in an arc. That's neuroscience. That's the visual system and attention. But they figured it out the other way from just pragmatic sort of trial and error, and then neuroscience can backfill an explanation as to why it works, which is interesting.
We have a theory called the in-transit action, which was dubbed by a great Spanish master, Arturo de Ascanio, and it is about concealing actions in the middle of recognized start and finish points. And if the viewer is casual and the starting and finish points of a given action are ordinary and normal, we can accomplish a secret action in between that won't be noticed.
Right.
Yeah. I think that now, as you say, attention is a lot of, and focus. Attention and focus issues seem to be the most interesting groundwork so far. So now, we have terms like that have suddenly become more common, like change blindness or inattention blindness. And that's a very tiny piece of what magicians use, but we do use those things. And I think that this kind of neuroscience work has exposed some of that. So far, in my estimation, I think magicians are in a better position to help neuroscientists than the other way around, frankly, in the sense of we have this body of knowledge that it's practical application. It's not the science of it, but it's interesting in the many conversations I've had with Stephen and Susanna of trying to extract where can we turn what I know into something that they can study, that they can turn into an experiment, right?
Yeah, and psychologists do use magic tricks as part of a psychological experimental design. They use tricks to study. They're not maybe trying to figure out why the trick works. They're just using it to study aspects of human behavior and attention. Maybe Sally can speak to this more than I can. And I know, like Bruce Hood in his book Super Sense writes a lot. He reviews a lot of the research in kids where they do magic tricks, then see how do kids respond to the magic trick in terms of like their ability to know that things persist even when you can't see them, for example. So it's part of how, and not only how we perceive things, but how we construct reality inside of our heads. There's all these built-in assumptions about how reality functions, and magicians know those assumptions and exploit them, and psychologists, completely independently of that, are just trying to figure out what assumptions we make just because they're trying to figure out how our minds work.
Right, and every time you have the experience of seeing a magic trick, whatever you think you saw is actually not what occurred, by definition. You constructed a reality that didn't occur. Something was either concealed from you, or you were or masked in some way.
And what's interesting, what I found interesting in just looking at the literature, is that there's a vast literature in the marketing research where they're also looking at a sort of applied neuroscience in order to get you to buy more stuff. And they're really sophisticated about it. It's almost scary. I mean, the detail with which they figure out like where you will look on products, and like if you just walking through the supermarket is a psychological experiment, because every product is placed to optimally increase your chances of purchasing it. And like to give you a very simplistic example, just walk down the cereal aisle, and of course, the simple thing is, the kids' cereals are at kids' eye level, and adult cereals, you go, it's like the Fruit Loops, then you get the brand cereal, and then you get, then they get the less and less child-friendly cereals. But it's more than that. They actually position on children's cereal boxes, there will be eyes looking down at the child. So they position it so that the eyes on the box will be a little bit above the average sort of eye level of the child. So there's something psychological there specifically that they're going for. So very, very, marketing research is sophisticated applied neuroscience to get you to buy stuff. I find that fascinating and scary at the same time.
But neuromarketing itself, well, it's hard to, I have a chapter on that too. It's a little hard to judge that because so much of the work is proprietary that it's not published. But I don't think we're going to have, Manchurian consumers anytime soon. In fact, none of these scares have ever. But the idea, again, is with the lie detection, which I didn't quite finish up on that, but one of the reasons why those experiments are interesting but of limited utility is because, in the lab situation, you've got nothing at stake, unlike a real potential criminal, and you're not instructed about what to lie about. And you can also, this makes me wonder if lie detection through brain-based methods will have any future, is that you can confound the technology so easily by doing math in your head or something, because you just...
Yeah, that reminded me of another point I was going to raise in terms of what can we see happening in the brain with fMRI scan? Can you see the process of lying versus telling the truth? Another thing that's really interesting, have you looked at the research where several different teams are trying to see if they could read pictures in somebody's mind? So they show you a picture, they ask you to think of the picture, and then they try to reconstruct the picture from looking at the fMRI scan of your brain. And they've been able to do it to a limited but very interesting degree.
Yes.
And then that could superficially seem to lend legitimacy to all the other stuff, the lie detection, everything. Well, if we could see pictures in your brain, pretty soon we'll be reading your dreams and reading your mind and telling if you're telling the truth or not. But what I think is important to point out is that there's a huge calibration phase, where they're making subjects look at pictures and then say, how does that relate to what's happening on the fMRI scan? And then they often have a finite set of things that they're choosing among, not like, think of anything, and then they see what it is. It's like, here's 10 possibilities, and then we'll tell which one of those 10 after we've calibrated those 10. And they're also picking the way low-hanging fruit because the occipital cortex, the visual cortex, is mapped in a sort of physical way. It's what we call somatotopic organization. It's the neurons are laid out in a grid that represents the image, but that's probably not that kind of direct physical relationship between the organization of neurons and the stuff that it's representing may not be true for anything that doesn't have somatotopic organization. So it may be true for what part of your body you're feeling and what part of your body you're moving, the sensory and the motor systems and the visual system, but probably not any abstract ideas or thoughts or even language. We won't be able to see words in your brain by looking at until we do, there would need to be a vast calibration phase. This is now a theoretical future technology where we could really scan neuronal activity much more fine-grained than we can now. Even then, there's so much diversity in terms of how brains are organized, and then of course all the stuff you've experienced and learned, all of your life experiences are in your brain, and they're different than every other 7 billion people on the planet. So how much calibration is going to be necessary before we can translate what we're seeing on a scan to what's happening in your mind? We don't know, but don't be overly impressed by these early studies of the low-hanging fruit of just looking at pictures in the visual cortex. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
Yeah.
I would. That takes machine learning, which is that phase you talked about. As far as the marketing goes, it reminds me of the lie detection in the sense that the core of it, there's some truth in the core of it, which is, for example, with lie detection, the polygraphy, for the reasons we talked about before, doesn't work very well. In marketing, focus groups are a bust. They became popular, I guess, in the 60s and 70s, and by the 80s they were already being basically discredited within the field, although I know it's kind of a trope of marketing where you get people in a room, because people are notoriously bad at saying what they're going to do, as in buy this, and also really bad at knowing why they like something. They know they like something, but they don't know why they like something. And marketers want to know why you like something so they can go back to the lab and build more of that in. And so the idea is to basically cut out the middleman, which is you, and go straight to your brain and see whether or not brain activity can give a more truthful and predictive indication of what it is either you're going to do in terms of making purchasing decisions or why you like something. And in my book, I could only get a hold of what are maybe the most ham-handed illustrations because the good stuff is kept under wraps. That's an optimistic reading of it. But some of the stuff that was in literature, I mean, like the Forbes literature and the Wall Street Journal, was scanning women while they look at pictures of potato chip bags, and that there was less activity in supposedly the guilt area, the anterior cingulate cortex, which does play a role in mediating conflict. But and because of that, they designed their bags with a matte finish and as opposed to a shiny finish. And the interpretation was women feel less guilty when they eat snacks that don't look like what kids would eat and whatever. And that might be, some of that might be true, but you could determine that behaviorally. And we don't know what the heck that activity means in the brain. But that was one illustration of it. But in general, with a lot of social, I guess you'd call social neuroscience, you'll get effects that are either fairly small and effect sizes that are pretty small and that are probably pretty short-lived. And the other thing is, while I'm sure you've read all about these, the classic one from Barg at Yale with people reading words, a list of words, and they had words within that list that would be associated with old people, like bingo, Florida, nursing home, I think, arthritis or whatever, and then people who were reading a more neutral list of words that didn't suggest really any characteristics of any particular group. And as they then left the study and walked down the hall to the elevators, the group that was confronted with the words reminiscent of aging walked more slowly. Well, maybe they did, but it was a matter of I think it was under a second or about a second. Nobody has any idea how fast they walked when they got out of the building, which I assume meant they just raced to their next class no matter what. And people encounter, they're impinged on every other second by other stimuli that may well counteract the stimuli you tested. So while it's not uninteresting, I don't mean to imply that, to see what effects these kinds of manipulations might have, to say that, well, now we can influence what people are going to buy by manipulating this and that, it has to be dilute because there are so many other factors people attend to.
Confluence versus causality yet again. Yeah. It's interesting about this, the focus groups, because just as a magician, as an artist, young magicians often make the mistake of, after asking people, family members and friends, what do you think of this trick? Did it fool you, this and that? Which can be a useful thing to a point, but to then ask why and ask for explanations. And advice from veterans like me is always, don't ask why. Find out what was wrong. But it's up to you to figure out how to fix it. Don't pay any attention to what people are saying. They actually don't know.
Yeah, you could get a lot of confabulated answers.
Yeah, exactly.
And it would really get you on the wrong.
Before we get to questions, although if you guys could bring up the mic, and if some folks want to accumulate, stand up for questions. But before we get to that, could somebody find me a fresh bottle of water, please, or two? But before we get that, I want to touch on one other element, which is a big subject of discussion. If we want to talk about the courts, it's not really happening yet too much, but certainly starting a great deal of discussion of the idea of neuroscience coming into the courtroom, particularly in the element of criminal responsibility for criminal acts, right? Which also brings us to the notion of free will versus responsibility, and we haven't got another weekend to talk about that. But if we could touch on that, I think it's incumbent upon us to do so.
Oh, sure, yeah, and that was a big part of, as you can imagine, the book as well. I'll try to be efficient about this. There are two separate problems in the sense. One is that neuroscience can tell you that in the case of the courtroom, my client was not able to form an intent to commit crime, or my client couldn't control himself, or my client can't think rationally, which are basically the descriptions one has to qualify in order to be held criminally responsible in the first place. Yet, the assumption within the criminal justice system as it works now, and as it works when people bring in brain scans, in fact, they're used now routinely in capital cases. People have sued because their lawyers didn't use brain scans in their capital cases. But in those cases, the assumption is my client has a damaged brain, not in a really organic, obvious way, because we could just, see the hole in his head. But I mean, there's something subtly wrong with his processing. But everybody else, but there's an assumption that people are otherwise responsible for their behavior. Then there's a further taking of this concept, which is that as we get better and better at understanding the neural mechanisms behind our actions, that will solidify the claims of hard determinists, which is to say that we never have a choice in our behaviors at all. Mm-hmm. And the implications then are that the criminal justice system should be overhauled so that of the 4 pillars of the criminal justice system, which are deterrence, we put people in jail to deter them and others from acting that way. We want everyone to see what happens to you when you do a bad thing. This is what happens. You get put in jail. We want to incarcerate you to protect the rest of us if you're a crazed murderer. Well, hopefully we could do some rehabilitation. And then there's retribution. Now, people have been arguing about this for decades, of course, but some neuroscientists seem to think that the more we understand the brain, that will drive home the need for a utilitarian criminal justice system, one that focuses simply on rehabilitation and containment and deterrence, and will basically kick the retributive pillar out from under the system. My last chapter, actually, it's called The Future of Blame, and that was inspired by James Q. Wilson, for those of you who know him, wonderful criminologist who died recently. But basically, there I talk about the fact that I think our intuitions about fairness are far too entrenched to allow that to happen, especially when it's a violent crime. I mean, we can do a lot better with nonviolent crimes in our society in terms of diversion programs, the ones I mentioned earlier and others. But in terms of violent crimes, what happens if you don't punish people? Mm-hmm. How do the victims feel? How does they actually feel? There's been some interesting research on they feel highly devalued, and their community devalues them when their assailants have not been punished. It's a prescription for vigilantism, because then you'll take it into your own hands. And it erodes confidence in the criminal justice system. So that's, actually I have data on that, to the extent one can measure that. There are some interesting data on that. But I also think, now granted, we've changed, our society has changed in many ways. You think of gay marriage and race relations and those kind of animal rights, but I just don't think we're ever going to get to the point where our innate sense of justice, Paul Bloom has written about this, manifesting in kids as young as months old, and fairness and reciprocity, that as a species can ever tolerate the notion that someone does not deserve to be punished for certain things.
Let me just quickly add that using brain scans to diagnose brain injury as a way of mitigating guilt in a legal system predates fMRI scans. That's as old as brain scans. And I can tell you just from the late 1980s, early 1990s, neurologist that I was training with was doing that. It was essentially diagnosing subtle frontal lobe lesions on just regular old CAT scans and saying this person has brain injury, and that could plausibly lead to a decreased ability to control his behavior, inhibit his criminal behavior, and that mitigates his guilt. What's scary in a way is that fMRI scans have created more tricky and subtle scans that lend themselves to abuse by lawyers who are eager to have questionable technology at their disposal that they can interpret any way they wish. So, the admissibility of that kind of data in a courtroom should be something that needs to be carefully reviewed, I would say.
Right, and science in the courtroom is always a difficult issue because you have the judiciary making decisions about science they know very little about, and that's why you want really more science allowed in terms of expert testimony than is often the case. And the thing, it may sound, futuristic what we were talking about lie detection, but in fact, those few entrepreneurial firms, both in the States and England, are already very aggressively pushing,
they have.
even before they have technology that they can prove in the scientific community. They don't really care if they can prove it established in the scientific community. What they care about is making money, and they're trying very hard to introduce that technology into the courts, as we speak.
Yes.
So do we have some questions? We have a few minutes if people want to come up and talk about things we've talked about or what seems to be related.
Hi. I had a question about the fMRI, and you were talking about the clinical utility, and I can understand the problems with the reductionist model, but I'm wondering, in terms of treatment, let's say, what about something like deep brain stimulation? Wouldn't that be an example of where the reductionist model really did help us? I mean, we put electrodes in people's brains, and based on what we know about depression, we treat their depression.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm not against reductionism, just hyper-reductionism. And the difference is, reductionism is a great way to understand the underlying, scientific causes of things. Hyper-reduction is when you start ignoring higher levels of complexity to say, like, evolution is all about genes competing with each other. Forget all about ecologies and species or whatever. And, brain, and your behavior is all about these two neurons communicating with each other. Forget about psychology and environment and all the other higher levels of complexity, hierarchically higher levels of complexity. So, hacking the brain electrically and magnetically is a very exciting area, and I think it has tremendous potential, and we're already seeing the earliest applications of it. And it is based upon our understanding of neuroanatomy and how it contributes to it, but there's also, it's a very specific clinical application. So even we don't necessarily have to 100% understand how the brain works. We could still say, all right, if I put my electrode here and put it up to this hertz, what happens? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does the tremor get better? Does the patient get less depressed? Do their migraines go away? So you could do clinical, and we often do that. We often will have clinical applications even before we fully understand mechanisms. But we know the brain's an electrical organ, and so you can manipulate its function electromagnetically, and we're doing that, and it's fine.
So the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Right, and also, but we wouldn't have gotten there without looking for those
mechanism is that's the that's the exciting part about mechanism.
That when the question was posed about treatment, and you were saying I couldn't really think of a. I guess
I said that for addiction, but I guess you said it for some.
Well, it was. I thought the question was: has fMRI led? Can you use fMRI specifically to treat somebody? And I couldn't think of an example. And diagnostically, it's tricky, but there is some low-hanging fruit. But just using neuroscience to treat people based upon our understanding of how the brain works, absolutely.
Exclusive. Okay.
Yeah.
The limits of the current level of knowledge, because fMRI is kind of top neuroscience, and the claims are far beyond what can be established with views. I don't think anybody here is trying to discourage the idea of that exploration. It's a question of what can we actually do with it right now.
Yeah, that kind of pop hype about science is always just going one or two steps beyond where we currently are. Doesn't mean the whole enterprise is not legitimate. Yeah.
Apologies if I missed this, but aren't there cases like where someone has got, some mental disease and they think they're in danger, but they're not, and they hurt somebody because of it? How does that fit into?
Yeah, well, luckily we have an insanity defense.
Yeah, what?
An insanity defense, so that if you don't know what you were doing or don't know that it was wrong, they're hard. There's a high bar for insanity, but if you've got it. A great example of this, in fact, this is a case from 2001, but to me it's paradigmatic. It's the Andrea Yates case that I bet most people remember, the Houston mom who drowned 5 kids in a bathtub. Yeah, her kids. And she thought, this was postpartum, she just had a young one, so it was a postpartum psychosis. She thought she was the devil and that she was infecting her children with evil, and, in this perverse logic, actually what she did followed actually pretty logically from her warped, perception. She had to save them because they were becoming devil children. So she drowned them. They did not do an fMRI at the time. If they did, they could probably do a better one now, but in any case, there's no neural signature, although we may find one at some point, and so much of the book has the phrase, as of yet. But right now, we still couldn't image Andrea Yates's brain and say this is a woman with postpartum psychosis. But she got off. She's still in jail, actually, but it's I guess it's a civil containment that she has. But she did qualify for not guilty by reason of insanity.
Yeah, and there definitely are people who have neurological, pathological conditions which cause them to do things that are crimes. But that's the question is not, can somebody ever do something because of their neurologically damaged?
Yes.
Sure, absolutely, and people get off for that all the time and legitimately. The question is, there's a little bit too much excitement about using very cutting-edge new technology to make those pronouncements, probably because they're so open to interpretation. But for that same reason, they're actually not very discriminatory. They're not useful yet.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Here. I was just wondering if you guys could just speak briefly about the state of the research going on, fMRI or otherwise, on the mechanisms of religion in the brain and how we could get rid of them.
I didn't ask the last part. How we can what?
How we can what? What was the last part of the question? Get rid of it?
How do we get rid of it?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I don't think I can answer the second part of the question, but, well, I mean, all I know about hyper-religiosity and religion, it does localize in the brain, and we know that because of people who have epilepsy. If you have seizures in the non-dominant temporal lobe, you can have religious experiences during a seizure, and those people who have non-dominant temporal lobe epilepsy can often have hyper-religiosity as a symptom, if you will, of their epilepsy. So there are parts of the brain that subsume religious experiences and religious tendencies, but that's the extent of my knowledge about it.
Thanks.
Psychiatric diseases are very complex, as we know. Do the medications that we have take a very reductionistic approach? We bump up neurotransmitters. Obviously, most psychiatric disease needs counseling of some type. Are we off base? I'm a primary care physician. I think we do an okay and variable job treating psychiatric disease. Are we off base on how we're treating it? Are we too reductionistic, or are we just primitive?
Well, gosh, yes. There are pockets of vast over-medication for sure. I think we see that with kids a lot. ADD especially, the diagnosis of childhood bipolar illness has gone off the rails, which is not to say there aren't kids who probably are highly disturbed and really need those meds and don't even get attention. So in a sense, all the problems are true. I think in general there is a too high or low a threshold for taking out the prescription pad before approaching people with in a more talk-based therapeutic way. I remember when I had a private practice, I was amazed. A few times I'd have a person come in with what looked like, what we used to call melancholic depression, but the most severe kind of autonomous depression, the kind that doesn't respond to, any good news or anything. It's just bad. And you think ECT sometimes for people like that, not even medication if it's really that bad and they're immobilized. But anyways, this lady did come in and we did talk, and the next week, even that modality of just talking, we probably would have added medication anyway after a while, and they do work synergistically, there's no question. But to think that someone this dysfunctional was able to respond somewhat just through a therapeutic relationship was shocking. So, but unfortunately, I'm not going to get into the mental health system, but there's no time. And when it's parents, they often want some quick fix for the kids, and the drill. So yes, that's a problem.
Yeah. This actually relates quite quite nicely to what
Oh,
you were just
good.
talking about. So what implications do you think fMRI could have on labeling of students that might have mental disabilities or intellectual disabilities?
You know, look, if it helps us, if it were to help us make a diagnostic determination that is different, I mean, if it was anything with more accuracy than we can do now, if it could do the same thing, why the expense and that's crazy. If it can help, and that degree of the margin of improvement, the incremental validity is greater, then you do want to pursue it. You have to be very careful, though, that this doesn't look like your fMRI. People run out of, when they hold up their ultrasounds, how you wouldn't want to put that fMRI on the refrigerator, but doesn't translate into, oh, this kid is fixed. This is it. And it induce a kind of pessimism and a sense that, the person won't respond. There are nice studies, so many of them, that show when a behavior is described to a group of people in the language of emotion, Susan committed this crime because she was upset because of some childhood, something, her childhood was bad, or she was angry about something, but put in psychological terms, versus Susan committed this crime because she had a neurological defect or a genetic contribution or a genetic predisposition. People will say, well, Susan couldn't help it, and Susan should get less of a sentence, and maybe Susan should, to get back to what that gentleman was bringing up earlier. There are crimes that are committed because people cannot control themselves and can't think straight and can't even form an intent to commit a crime. The thing is, we can't tell who they are, and I'll say yet, who knows what will happen, again, through this technology. But there is a kind of fatalism. It's really instinctual. I think it's just one of the intuitions, frankly, that when we see mechanism, we tend to think, the average person tends to think a kind of static
I
state.
think part of that is due to the fact that we have this illusion that we're not our brain, that we're an individual, and when you start to frame things in the terms, in neuroscientific terms, people think that that's somehow different than how they thought of themselves or how they thought of people. It's like, well, no, we all are our brains. So describing it in neuroscientific terms isn't really any different, but people, they don't think of themselves that way. So they think so there's a false dualism or dichotomy between the brain and the cell and the mind, but it's the same thing.
And one last question.
So there's the idea that addiction is beyond our control, and the case with the woman drowning her kids, because that was out of her control. Is there a difference between those types of out of someone's control, or like a neurological difference, and should we be distinguishing that in the criminal, in the justice system?
Well, right, one's deterrable and one isn't. We were talking about that earlier. I mean, well, if you happen to be an addict and you happen to kill someone, you will pay a price for that. But in the case of the woman with the psychotic illness, that for at that time was a fixed cognition for her, that she is contaminated and her kids will rot in hell. And she did, arguably, the protective thing, and through this perverse lens, which was to try to save them by killing them and not making them vulnerable anymore. There's nothing, I can't talk her out of it. I couldn't say, if you think differently about this, oh, come on, here's a reward, or here's a consequence, a punishment that, you can't change that kind of thinking. You can definitely work with addicts to change their behavior, definitely. And they change them all the time. One thing, I guess this will be my last point, that most people don't realize is that, and my profession hasn't helped this misconception, which is that most people who have a drug and alcohol problem and a dependence, meaning, addiction, actually do recover. They recover spontaneously, which is to say they recover without help, and they do it by their early 30s. That's not everyone, and you're thinking, of course, of some horrible case of a friend you know, or Philip Seymour Hoffman, or something like this. Clearly, that happens. But in those situations, you tend to find people who also have additional mental mental illnesses as well. And I don't mean psychosis, I mean depression, anxiety. That's who's overrepresented in the people for whom this is more chronic and relapsing. I certainly don't mean to imply if you know someone and they're 28 and they have an alcohol problem, say, well, hang on, statistically, 3 years you'll be over this. That's not what I mean at all. I'm just making a sort of an epidemiologic statement here, but it's fundamentally an optimistic thing, and it again shows this is not as NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, says in its full glory that addiction is a chronic and relapsing brain disease. It's a very discouraging way to look at a problem that we can help a lot with.
And on that optimistic note, thanks very much to Steve and Sally for the discussion. Thank you.